You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
It rocks, but it doesn't rock too hard. The singers all seem to be saying, hey, it's gonna be okay.
It's perfect sitting down dancing music.
Also known as Yacht Rock.
Welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about music documentaries brought to you by treblezine.com. Lots of great writing about music there, which we will direct you to in the show notes, etc. I'm David Lizerbrand, here with my co-host,
Andrew Keats.
And we are here with our returning friend of Rock Docs here, Garret Price, who he was on, a couple years ago, I don't know, 3 years ago, something like that, for his previous film, which was Woodstock, Peace, Love, and Rage, part of the then HBO Music Box, now Max. And he's back with another Music Box episode, as they call it, or whatever, another film under that imprint, a slightly mellower film. Maybe we'll talk about that transition, but yeah, it's Yacht Rock, a documentary, and this is an audio medium, but there's a pun hidden in there if you want to look up the name in writing. Anyway, Garret, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back, guys. I really appreciate it.
I guess probably the most obvious question here is just like, so you did Woodstock 99, obviously violence, mayhem, some good music and some bad things happening, maybe is a very short way to say it. And then you pivoted to this one. Were you just looking for a slightly different, more mellow vibe, or how did this one come about?
I mean, absolutely. It's actually a number of things kind of all happened at once. HBO and The Ringer asked if I'd want to pitch another music doc when they did this new season of Music Box. And I knew that if I were going to do one, it needed to be much lighter than the Woodstock 99 one. Woodstock was a Trojan horse film, I call it. I kind of used the festival really to explore, late 90s socio-political culture in America. And I knew if I was going to do another music doc, I wanted one that actually celebrated music and showcase music. And I didn't know what that was at the time. And I was working as an editor on a TV series called Daisy Jones and the Six, which, so I was completely immersed in this 1970s Los Angeles music scene. But what I noticed is that, a lot of people have romanticized more about, I think, the Fleetwood Mac stories of that time, the Eagles, Laurel Canyon, the Troubadour. Yet there was this whole other scene happening in town at these recording studios. We had this ecosystem of recording studios in 1970s Los Angeles, and these incredible studio musicians and session players were working day and night there. So that really interested me. And coincidentally, I met Christopher Cross's daughter through a friend. And no kidding, her best friend and roommate is Michael McDonald's daughter.
No.
And we
Come on.
Right? Mind blown. And we were hanging out at a bar one night, and she was like, you should do a documentary about our dads and this name Yacht Rock that has kind of come to define their music, 30 years after the fact. And I was like, that's really interesting. But from their point of view of what they think about this word that, has been bequeathed upon their, life's work. And from there, they got me a sit down with their dads. That was my very first interview. And I saw the dynamic between Chris and Mike, and I was like, there's a story here. And that was kind of the beginning of it. And so I pitched that to HBO and to Bill Simmons at The Ringer. They absolutely loved it, and we were off to the races.
Were you steeped in that sort of that scene and the history and sort of the anecdotes and stories and the things that tied them together? Was that something you had already learned about, or did you pick up a lot of that history in the making of the film?
In the making of the film, this was definitely not the music I gravitated towards. I knew of the comedy series. I'd seen it years ago, the Yacht Rock series, the web series, and I knew the music, of course, but it wasn't music I particularly loved. And I think going into this project, I kind of did what a lot of people do. They kind of go into this world ironically because of the name. But I got to tell you, man, once I started to really learn the stories behind the music and the artistry and the musicianship, I fell in love with this music. And I really wanted to reflect that in the movie I made. and let the artists really talk. I wanted to get all, the mocking, the pop culture punchline stuff out of the way at the very beginning, and really just take us into this world.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely, and just for the purpose of this, we'll assume that people have seen the movie. It's not really a spoilery kind of thing. If you like this kind of thing,
Right.
and you haven't seen it, I don't think us telling you what happens in the film is gonna turn you off. But so I wanted to ask. We've had the okay, well I don't remember his title. He's like sort of the writer of the movie, Steve Hyden, on story producer, whatever you guys call.
Yeah, I'm a story producer. Yeah.
We've had him on twice on Rock Doc, so this is kind of like tying the threads together, much like the the film itself. But how did he get involved, and what's the role of somebody who is kind of a writer or a story producer on a documentary?
Yeah, so I met Steve when I did the Woodstock 99 documentary. He had done a podcast with The Ringer. And, I listened to a little bit of that. I kind of used that as part of my research doing that. And of course, I brought him in as a talking head. So he was kind of more of a consulting producer for me on Woodstock. And, I'm a big fan of his writing and kind of his cultural critiquing and, his knowledge of music. He's a musicologist. He knows so much. And so I knew if I was going to do the music doc, I wanted to bring him in into a more kind of a role that, that he could help me out on. And, there's so much research involved in a film like this, especially a world that I'm not real familiar with. So I brought him in also, and we kind of buckled down and did all the research, started drawing all the lines, kind of figuring out what this story was going to be. Like, look, I always knew there's going to be like a rise, a fall, and a resurrection to this, which always makes for a great rock doc, right? A lot of them have that kind of format, but like I knew that like I didn't want to overanalyze culture in this one. I kind of wanted to just be a hangout movie. You just hang out with these guys. These guys, I feel like they've been skipped over a bit
Yeah.
at this time period. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people, just automatically go to like your Stevie Nicks and your Don Henleys and your Joni Mitchells in that world. And a lot of people, these guys don't get asked a lot about their time period, their time making music at this time. So they were so excited and passionate, and and I think it comes across in the interviews of telling their stories about making music, and they're all friends also, which is pretty remarkable. To this
Yeah.
day, they're all still friends. So I think that really shines also in the film.
Yeah, I mean it stands in stark contrast just listening to them talk about their despite considerable fame in the late 70s and early 80s, they're just less famous people than Glenn Fry, yeah,
Right.
and Stevie Nicks. And so listening to them talk is much more like listening to a really interesting guy in your neighborhood talk than it is like
Right.
listening to one of the biggest celebrities of the last 50 years talk. And so it does make for a much more hangout vibe.
Yeah, I'm
So
good. That's
mission
what I was going
accomplished on
for.
that front.
Thank you. I appreciate
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
One of the things that happens at the top of the movie is you have a couple different people come in and attempt to define what yacht rock is. And I like where that starts because I think anybody who's been even even like accidentally aware of this world for the last 20 years has had a conversation like that. What is yacht rock? What isn't yacht rock? How do you describe yacht rock? I'm curious, after putting this movie together, do you have a stock answer for what yacht rock is?
I kind of follow the rules of the creators of the web series. I think that's the best way to do it. And like when you really look at the parameters they set up, it does make sense as this subgenre. This is highly produced pop music, heavily infused with jazz, R&B, soul, and gospel, being made specifically in Los Angeles and Southern California, and including some of the world's best session studio guys. And when you do that, you start to kick out a lot of these, other soft rock acts. I think people synonymously, call yacht rock. Uh,
Yes.
and I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of people just think all soft rock is called a yacht rock now. And I wanted to, play with that idea a little bit. That's why I brought, I did the talking heads at the top, just like everyone has their own definition of this. And it's like, okay, no, this is the real definition from the guys that created it.
Yeah, I have a good friend, shout out Pat Puccini, who's really exercised by the common misconception that Brandy is a yacht rock song. Really, really angry at all
I mean,
times
Andy,
that
the tweets I have gotten about like, why have you not included this in your documentary? Why didn't you include this? How dare you say Hall and Oates or the Eagles or Fleetwood Mac's not a yacht rock band? It's like, I'm not setting the rules here, guys.
Yeah.
I didn't make this up.
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about that like beginning part because you do kind of get the kind of the I mean the movie has a fairly light tone throughout, but you do get kind of the jokey stuff out of the way at the beginning. I mean,
Mhm.
I will certainly cop to in 2005, 2006 going to when this kind of started happening, going to a few like, yacht rock parties where everybody was wearing a sailor hat and things like that. Um it's kind of surprising to me that that's still a thing, and I'm not saying like I'm on the cutting edge or something like that. It's just like I was that age at that time that I was that, and but it was always done. Everybody who's there was had affection for the music
Right.
in my world. You know what I mean? It was never like, let's listen to this shitty music and
I
make
mean, I
fun of
think
it.
that's why
That would
it
not
got.
be fun.
I think that's why it got popular because everyone was like they also did like it. It's like what makes like a popular and this music is obviously not parody, but like for a parody song to transcend whatever little like joke it is, you have to actually want to listen to it, you know?
Right.
And and so it's sort
Absolutely.
of like so it's like which ones of the SNL songs have like lasted at all? It's ones that are actually catchy and fun to listen to. And so like Yacht Rock, people liked it. So it was easy to start joking and throwing parties because you got to listen to this music.
Yeah,
Right.
that's why I had Fred Armisen on it. Honestly, I think he spoke very
Yeah.
straight up to that. It's like, this if we're making parodies of your music, it's because it's relevant. It means something to us and a lot of people. I went in with this kind of with like the notion. I go, I want to have fun, but not make fun of this
Mhm.
music, and that was really kind of my mantra throughout the whole process.
Um so I mean, I just like I have to imagine because this movie's like maybe 90, 100 minutes.
Yeah,
You're a professional film editor, so you probably know to the frame. But
96 minutes. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. But the obviously this is like a give or take 6 year period of music you're covering, as well as things that came before and came after, and all these different people. So there's only certain things you can cover, and somebody who I've seen comments on different, I'm looking at people's responses to the movie. People are like, well, how could they not include this one? Okay. Yeah. It's not intended to be a comprehensive, encyclopedia of yacht rock. That's not the intention. But what did you end up leaving on the cutting room floor? What did you want to include that you just couldn't fit into the format and into the, kind of the arc of the movie?
Yeah, there's some cool sections we had. Like I had a whole section on critics in the '70s and the reaction to this music, and they were so harsh to these artists. Like Toto, oh my god! I mean, critics hated them. They called them like they're a corporate band. They were so mean to them. Doobie Brothers with Michael McDonald, man, they got ripped apart by Rolling Stone. Christopher Cross, Jesus Christ. I mean, it's like they were so rough. So I had a whole section with that, and also like well also about punk music also kind of making,
Mhm.
it's emerging at the same time, alongside this music. So that was cool, but like, at a point it becomes an embarrassment of riches. You start to kind of lose the plot a little bit. And the more I have other people talking about this music versus the artists themselves talking about making this music, you start to lose a little bit of the heart. And I started going down a road that didn't feel right for this movie, so to speak. So things like that, there's people I talked to that I couldn't find a way. I'll give you one. Alan Parsons I interviewed, who's
Oh
awesome. Like
yeah.
he's the most incredible person, and like because I had this whole vision of like talking about studio perfection and having Alan Parsons, who's like this incredible, producer and engineer besides being an artist himself. He worked with Pink Floyd, he worked with the Beatles, and it just again, the beginning of my movie started becoming, you know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes before we even get to like, Michael McDonald. And it's just like it gets tough when this stuff happens. So you kind of have to like, make these tough decisions in the end that service the story. But I knew always that I wanted to stick kind of this Mount Rushmore of artists, and that being,
Mhm.
Michael with and without the Doobie Brothers, Kenny Loggins, Christopher Cross, Steely Dan, of course, and then Toto. And I knew if I started there, I can get a little some ancillary people in there too, like Ambrosia, have a little sub story with them, and Brenda Russell, and some of the session guys like Tom Scott and Jay Graydon. But and then I also knew that I wanted contemporary artists too. That was really important to bring in.
Yeah. So along these lines, something that seems like a subplot that's like happening in the background of the movie, like a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern type type plot. And I wonder if you could tell me if this is at all intentional, is the areas of overlap with the other music that was popular at this time that was definitively not yacht rock, and that goes uncommented upon here, even in the yacht versus yacht sections. So specifically, I think of like the Bee Gees,
Yep, disco.
um,
Yep,
which disco and the Bee Gees, and when I say it's happening in the background, like we get a Barry Gibb walking out um,
Barbara Streisand.
with Barbara
yeah,
Streisand at the
yep,
Grammys, 4 or 5 different clips of the top of the charts show the Bee Gees right
yep,
there alongside these acts. And so, like, the Bee Gees are obviously not yacht rock. That's
right.
not what they are doing. And yet, like, I Believe in Love by Loggins sounds very much like the Bee Gees to me.
Yep,
The Loggins and Stevie, Whenever I Call You a Friend, sounds a lot like Maxine Nightingale's Right Back Where We Started From to me. Like, I think they're, and obviously they have sort of common ancestors, that both of
absolutely.
these areas. And so how much of that was intentional, and how much did you ever consider putting a finer point on that?
Yeah, we started also when I brought up the critics and talking about punk, disco was the other side of that also. That was
Hmm.
kinda coming out at the same
Yeah.
time, and again, it started to kinda, and disco's like you said, disco is a bit more similar actually to yacht rock in its
Yeah.
influence.
Yeah.
So, it was starting to kinda muddy the waters a little bit, but it still belongs in this time period, right? So we kinda you're right, I'm glad you noticed that. It was still there alongside this, these other artists making this specific music we're talking about, and of course, you brought up, Stevie Nicks and, like, Fleetwood Mac is still there doing their thing and more on the soft rock side, and the Eagles too, but also important, is, like, R&B going on, Earth, Wind& and Fire also, and, and Stevie Wonder. So, eh, music didn't just stop, but it is interesting how popular this music was. Yeah, I mean, what we call it, I'll
I,
just call it yacht rock. It's insanely popular at this
I
time.
I have to say that is of like things I like absolutely learned from this
Yeah,
movie. I did not know what chart-topping, Grammy-winning, like, most popular music in the world these acts were. I knew they were, like, ubiquitous on popular radio at the time, and that fed into how they had such lasting influence, but I did not realize that this was, like, essentially popular mainstream popular music, like.
right, isn't it wild that, like, you could be a pop star in your mid-30s as a white
Yes,
male,
I
back in the
know.
late '70s and early '80s?
These
It's
Watching
pretty
these
remarkable.
Grammys, it's such an adult affair.
Right,
It's like,
Yeah.
like
Everybody's
every
wearing tuxedos, like not ironically.
yeah.
You know what I
right.
mean? It's like this is what you do when you get dressed up, and yeah, it's such a different world.
It's so wild, and, like, I think another, like, we make a case that, like, MTV, of course, in the '80s, I think technology are one of the things that kinda pushed these artists, out a little bit, but I think also just, like, being overly successful. I think people just got kinda tired of it at a certain point, they're ready for change too, when you're winning all the Grammys every year after year, you're dominating music, and, I always say in these interviews that, like, this music, we it's kind of the soundtrack of our lives, whether we like it or not, because it's always just been there in the background, you know, our whole life, like,
Yeah,
supermarkets and pharmacies and doctor's offices, and our parents' cars, like, I think we've always just taken it for granted a bit.
right.
Right? And not really understanding what
Yeah.
this really is.
Well, in the uh film History of the Eagles, and he's in my favorite film, not Rock Doc, just in all of cinema.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
Glenn
amazing.
Fry
It's amazing,
talk,
yeah. It's
Glenn
amazing.
Fry. Glenn Fry talks about how like the band broke up in '79 or whatever, and then like right after that is when the classic rock format was created. So he talks about how like basically from people's perspective, the Eagles never went away. Like they thought they would break up, and then like most bands, that would be kind of it. But like their songs just kept living on as though they still were together all through the '80s and so forth. And for the most part, a lot of these artists, I mean, Steely Dan's an exception, and maybe the
The Do-
occasional Doobie Brothers song,
Doobie
things like
Brothers.
that.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
would say.
but a lot
Mhm.
of these artists did not make it into that classic rock canon that the Eagles made it into, and Fleetwood Mac did, but not like, I don't know, maybe the Bee Gees, or I don't know, Barry Manilow, or somebody else who was popular at the time, and maybe the same person would have listened to one and the other.
It's
And it's like a decision that some guy in some office in Chicago made in 1980 is still happening, still has these effects downstream 50 years later or whatever, and we're here talking about it.
Isn't that wild? Like, talking to like Christopher Cross and Kenny, they toured with the Eagles and Fleetwood
Yeah.
Mac. Like they were the opening acts. Like these artists were lumped together. And then you're right. Someone made the decision that the Eagles are classic rock. Christopher Cross, Kenny Loggins, they are AOR radio, and they got lumped in
Right.
over here. Right? It's pretty wild when they were all kind of like equals at a certain point in the late '70s, and it's pretty interesting and weird and strange and kind of remarkable to go back and look and seeing, where that split happens. And it had a significant, ramification to their careers, I think. They,
S- yeah.
Christopher talks about like,
Speaking.
yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, well, I was going to say. Speaking of which, I wonder did there appears to be a still photo used in I think it's during the section where you're talking about Steely Dan famously churning through session players. Um, do you know is that a shot of Timothy B. Schmidt from the Eagles rocking a bass in the studio with the Steely Dan guys at some point?
It might have been. Yeah. So what's so cool about all those Steely Dan photos
Yeah.
is I befriended Roger Nichols' daughter, Simsy Nichols. Roger Nichols was like the famous engineer
Mhm.
of Steely Dan, invented the Wendell machine, like the famous drum machine.
Yeah.
All that. And he was a amateur photographer, so he was taking pictures during all these sessions of Asia and Gaucho, and the Royal Scam, and they've just been sitting in as negatives in Simpson's garage, and we got them all developed, and a lot of those photos have never been seen before. So maybe it is. I don't even know actually, truthfully.
Okay.
I'll have to go back and look. Well, we'll have to
Yeah.
pause it.
I'll just say in the like my phone all of a sudden blew up with Andy watching this movie, going like, Timothy B. Schmidt sighting
I mean,
when he was watching the movie a few days ago. I'm like, wait, I didn't even catch that.
if you think it's him, it's probably him. It's like when you see a celebrity at somewhere,
I'll
you're like,
say-
I know,
yeah.
I know that person, and it usually is that person.
We'll post this online, and Rock Docs fans can judge for yourself. Yeah, just do your own research is what we like to say around here. So okay, so I'm just like kind of curious about some nuts and bolts stuff,
Yeah.
because obviously we watch so many of these things. Like I'm just curious, like you have so many interviews with Michael McDonald is in this movie a lot, for example. Okay, makes sense. But you have a lot of interviews with people like, I don't know, Mac DeMarco or Thunderbird, Prince Paul, Questlove, you name it, who, pop up. They, you see them on screen once or twice. They say their little bit, and it goes on. So how does that work? Just in terms of like, you schedule with somebody, they get to set, there's lighting, there's all these other things involved. And like, I can't imagine you're only interviewing them for 30 seconds. Like, how long do these interviews go? Like,
Uh,
how does that all work?
Usually an hour for guys like that aren't the actual artists themselves, and the artists themselves usually a couple hours. I have, you know, Chris and Michael a little bit longer. It's dude, these doing these interviews, it's exhausting for everybody. For being in the chair, being interviewed, for me doing the interviews, for the crew, sitting around doing it all. And you only get so much good stuff after a certain amount of time. People just get tired and they
Right.
start to lose stuff. For the contemporary guys and the modern musicians, like all those were chosen very carefully. I knew they all had a relationship with this music. I wasn't just trying to find a famous person to put him in this movie. Like Mac
Right.
DeMarco and Michael McDonald are friends. They talk to each other all the time. And
Love
if
that.
you look at Mac DeMarco's music, you hear some of the similar vibes,
Sure.
Totally.
influence. Thundercat obviously
Yeah.
loves Michael and Kinney. Questlove is just obsessive about this music. So they're all chosen. I knew Questlove's a bit more like the Yacht Rock guys. He's kind of a spirit guide of this
Yeah.
music and kind of can take me through. Where with Thundercat and Mac and this other session player Brian Robert Jones is a modern day session guitarist. I knew I knew they loved this music. I didn't know how much they loved it until I got them from that camera, and I saw these interviews were just so endearing, and and passionate about. Like, Thundercat surprised the hell out of me. I mean,
Dude, Thundercat loves Yacht Rock, man. That
loves it.
dude loves
Thundercat is real.
Real, yeah. Not saying they're not all real, but man, but
Yeah.
he was so
Yeah.
there's so many great lines. So, listen, I try not to make these bites feel like shoe polish, just say, "Oh, everything's great, everything's great, everything's great," 'cause I hate that
Right.
stuff. It needs to add something to it.
Yeah.
And if it's not adding something, at least if it gives a little bit of, comedy, you know, in this, or just a little bit of fun and keep the mood going, or a transitional bite, or set something up in the storytelling, I lean into that too. You
But
know,
like, but like as an editor, I mean, do you go into that thinking like, okay, I'm going to have an hour with this person or 45 minutes. Like, I want to get this because I need this for the movie. Or is it kind of like whatever we get is great? I'll take that
yeah.
30 seconds of gold, or what's your intention there?
Yeah, I just go in and kinda get the most broad interview I possibly can, do a bunch of research about the person I'm interviewing, and I keep it as conversational as possible. I think a lot of people, they go in these interviews, and they ask a question and they're worried about getting the next question in
Yeah.
Mhm.
versus, like,
They don't listen. Yeah, don't listen.
listening to what the conversation's happening and building upon that. You
Yeah.
know, people wanna talk, people wanna talk about stuff, and just give them that space to talk. And I think way too many people cut people off and move on to the next thing. And again, my editor brain is always working. I still consider myself an editor first, like a director second. So I'm thinking about what runway I can give them that I can use in that edit bay, use it to serve the film. And with those guys, I talked to a lot of them after I talked to the actual artists themselves. So I kind of knew some of the beats that I was gonna feed upon. So, I'm pushing things a certain way, things I wanna expand upon. I know which way to go. And then, some of it just magic happens. You get things that you weren't expecting.
So one of the themes that you have in the movie is the sort of rarity of a genre being described or defined, 25 years after the fact.
Mhm.
Um, and part of that in this case is sort of the silliness of Yacht Rock, the captain's hats and the Yacht Rock review, touring acts and that sort of thing. And all of the musicians that you talk to, seem to sort of bristle at that stuff. That's not their favorite stuff here.
Mhm.
Um, but none of them is from what I can tell dispute the idea that this was a scene, that they were working together and they were playing a similar type of music, and that they recognized the shared sensibility, and they were sort of reacting to each other, and all of the other things that you expect from a genre or a scene. And so I wonder, did anybody ever talk to you about sort of whether they were consciously aware, whether they consciously thought of themselves as a bubbled in thing at the
Yeah.
time, in real time, or did they need also the 25 years history to see it in reverse as the thing that it's come to be described as?
Interestingly, I think they needed the thing. I think they needed those,
Really?
like, those dots connected oddly. I think Kinney says a line in the doc, Kenny Loggins, about, like, we were just doing we were just progressing our pop music. We didn't realize we're actually making a genre of music. This is just the sound we liked. And I
Yeah.
think it took years later to realize, oh, this really does make sense as a genre, so to speak. I don't know if they love the name Yacht Rock. And again, it's interesting. I think their hesitation, I think there's a lot of miscommunication with the word. The guys that created it, called it Yacht Rock, not because of the nautical themes and all that. It's because the music just sounded so expensive and sheen and grand and
Yeah.
sleek,
Yeah.
like a yacht. That's where the name came from. They threw the captain hats on just because they were filming out near Marina Del Rey as just a little prop. They had no idea that that would turn in. They created this monster with this thing that people would latch on to, like, the cosplay of the series. Um, but to their credit, they connected the dots. They were reading the liner notes and they were
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, this guy played with this guy. This guy played with this guy," and it goes on and on and on. And I tried to recreate that in kind of the spider web of a graphic to
Yeah.
show how there really is kind of like this big bang that happened with Steely
Like a
Dan in our
like a Bill
music business.
Walsh coaching tree.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but I think with the word, the artists themselves, I think they were allergic to the word because to them, yacht rock sounds like, let's be real, music for rich white yuppies. And that was against everything they were influenced by in their music, you know?
Yeah.
And they made it very clear in their interviews to me that they loved R&B and jazz and soul and gospel. They loved black music. And
Yeah.
so this word yacht rock was like everything against, the music that influenced them. And they wore those influences on their sleeve, I think, I think there's a long history of appropriating music and rock and roll. And I think if anything, these guys at least admit where their influence came from.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so interesting about this type of music is it was everywhere. I think it's so cool when we talk about how hip hop kind of were the first to to find this music and bring it back because these records were in their parents' record collections. It played on black radio stations. A lot of them didn't even know they were white artists until they bought the albums, which we talk about. So it's in a world where I think the '80s go on, and a lot of people abandoned this music. I
Yeah.
think the black audience always kind of stayed with it, which is really interesting, and kind of brought first to bring it back into the fold.
Well, there's also the bristling at the Yacht Rock is also like no one seems to ever like the name that is bestowed upon their scene.
Right.
Right.
Like we watched,
Emo,
yeah,
jam
Or
bands.
new metal, or I mean,
yeah,
it's like
Right.
yeah.
yeah,
Like we watched the movie Hype about the '90s Seattle scene, and like they all fucking hate grunge. They absolutely hate
Thank
grunge.
grunge is a perfect example. Yep.
Right.
Yeah. But it is interesting that it took somebody else to realize that they were all playing on each other's records.
Right.
And that they didn't realize that they were seeing each other all the time, or that obviously they realized it, but they didn't realize that said something
But
about
it's so interesting. It's like this era of like session players, and honestly, in a recording studio,
mhm.
you had so many different like artists playing in a studio, and like you could go next door and hey, look, the Doobie Brothers are playing, and Christopher Cross is playing. Michael, can you come over here? I've worked with you before. I just need some vocals on the backgrounds of this song. Hey, Michael, this is Chris. Nice to meet you. And who knows, they're gonna be 30 years friends for the rest of their lives. Like, I think that is a bygone era, right? Of making music. I think it's so, people are in rooms on a computer,
Yeah.
making music that's disposable now versus these like this era of these session players working day and night, you know, working
Right.
together and collaborating and coming up with a
If you
sound.
need you need a bass line, you download it. You just put
Right.
that out. Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah,
god.
I mean, I guess the scene thing is interesting because like the predecessors to them, like the Laurel Canyon scene or the Bay Area like psychedelic whatever or whatever you want to name it, like they all had like identifiable fashion, which
Yeah.
I don't think these guys. You can look back and see it, and like they all look so good, but I don't. I think there was a time when people thought they looked dorky, but now like
Right.
it's undeniable that all these people were just rocking it. But like they're just studio rats is the thing.
Yep.
So like, there's not a lot of talk in the movie, and maybe they all like knocked off and went to the same bar afterwards. Like, there had to be some socializing outside of work.
Yeah.
But primarily it was like these people were in show business. They were in the profession of music.
Yep.
And like that's what they seem to view themselves as, not that they didn't have a good time or
Yeah.
whatever. I'm sure there was some sex and drugs to go with the rock and roll, but like that's not the focus of the movie. But it's not like
There weren't
you know
acid tests.
there weren't
Even if
acid
Christopher
tests.
Cross did write lyrics on acid while driving to
Right. Right.
Houston,
It's a great
Right.
riff.
It wasn't it
Yeah.
wasn't an organic scene that arose out of like we were all hanging out at the same folk clubs, and then they were hanging out in the studio. So this is where it all happens. And that's I think maybe why it wasn't recognized as a scene in the same at the time, because it wasn't you couldn't like have pictures or a news crew go down and show it's just like guys in the studio. It's less it's less obviously sexy than like a bunch of stoned teenagers walking around San Francisco.
And let me tell you, like trying to make a visual documentary when you don't have cameras in the studios, because these guys never thought they're going to be, a documentary made about them is rough. But also, like, there was a lot of these are a lot of contained bands we're talking about. And these guys were, besides Toto, they're kind of like doing their own thing. They need these studio musicians to come in and record these tracks and stuff like that. So it's really interesting to kind of look back, years later and see how this thing emerged. And I think a lot of them took kind of the Steely Dan approach. It's like there's me, and I can bring in these incredible world-class players to come play on my albums, and get it the way I want it to sound. And I think it's really interesting. It's much more like a producer engineer world and
Mhm.
session player world this time. This music's
I gotta ask about the Donald Fagen encounter,
yes,
which is kind of jumps out at the movie. And first of all, okay, so like you call up Donald Fagen, and there's you play in the film the brief recording, phone recording with him, where you basically say it's like a movie about yacht rock, and he says "Go fuck yourself" and hangs up. So like first of all, just practically speaking, he had to clear that, I would assume, for the
yeah,
movie, right? I mean, just that wasn't a surreptitious recording. That's
yeah,
it's a two-party consent state in California. And you're not going to put it in the movie without his permission. And he also gave, I mean, there's a lot of Steely Dan music in it.
yep,
He owns the publishing, or at least half of it. So um so I'm gonna. To me, that seems like that's him doing Don Fagen, which is what you want, in a way. But how did you think about that when it happened? I mean, clearly you wanted to interview the guy,
yeah,
and I mean, and this put you in the movie in a way that
yeah.
otherwise you're not. So how did
I
that? How
lo-
did you think about that
oh,
in the
I
moment?
love being in my movies. It's the last thing I ever want to be is my own movie. So it's really funny. It's you know these these rock docs are only as good as having the music in the movie, right? Like especially a movie like this where it's all about the music and you have to hear the songs to really understand what these songs are and how they all can be lumped together in a genre. I have this whole movie done, right? I've got 54 syncs in this film in total. Everything is cleared except for the Steely Dan songs. I've been waiting. We've had some conversations with Donald trying to be a part of this. Kind of, he'll think about it. Goes on. A year goes on. A year and a half goes on. Movie's done. Everything's cleared. Steely Dan. I have 6 syncs in there, uh, and it's still not cleared. And I'm like, what am I gonna do like if this doesn't happen? I don't know how to tell the story of Yacht Rock without Steely Dan because it's again we kind of bring it. It's kind of the Big Bang or the primordial ooze of which Yacht Rock sprang, as we describe it in the film. And we finally get a phone call from Irving Azoff of the Eagles and
Mm.
Steely Dan fame. He goes, Garrett, I love the film. Donald's never gonna sign off on the music. He hates the word yacht rock. I'm like, what? I'm like, Irving, it's a love
Mhm.
letter. It's a love letter to Steely Dan. I promise. Can you just watch the film? He's like, we'll see. I'll let you know, but most likely it's not gonna happen. You have to think of an alternative. I was like, oh my gosh. He calls back a couple days later. He goes, okay, I've talked to Donald. He's gonna call you one day. He said
Mm.
if you record the conversation, he'll consider licensing the music to you. I was
Mm.
like, okay. Weeks go by. I'm answering every single phone call, every telemarketer, every unknown caller, every political call coming in at this time, this last year also, everything. And sure enough, I think on Wednesday at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Garrett, it's Donald Fagen. And I'm just like, I'm getting ready to leave to go pick up my kids. Donald, I had an app where I could record the audio. If I switched over and push the app, I could
Right.
record the audio. I hang up on him with no callback
Oh,
number.
geez.
And I'm like, "Oh my god, I've blown it." And I'm just sitting there like, "What do I do now? I don't know what to do." He calls back. He's like, "Got one more shot at this kid." I go, "All right." I just put it on speaker, push record on my laptop, and that's the conversation that happened. Um, and I get
Interesting.
off. Azoff calls back and says, "Fagan signed off on the music. It's all yours." And that's the thing. So, you're right. It's Fagan being Fagan. It's a wink. I think he gets it. He can't deny that this word has brought a legion of fans into the Steely Dan universe. But, it's
Mhm.
it's and it's also kind of the cherry on top. Like, it's kinda, in a weird way, cooler than actually sitting down and talking to him in the end, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. It's this is kind of a rock star thing, when I was I mean, it's a much different tone, but when I was like 16, I think I was about 16, I met Michael Stipe like in a hotel lobby, and I go up to him and I go this is like 1992, 93. So he's like, the REM's as big as it gets, and I go up to him and I'm like, "Oh my god, whatever, I'm your biggest fan." Whatever I said, and, I was like, "Could I get an autograph?" And he's like, "I only sign autographs for charity, but I'll shake your hand." And I was like, this guy is operating on a level of cool that I can't even conceive of. And I
Right.
think Donald Fagen is a little bit, in his own way is like that. Like, he's got, so that's, I mean, much like in the studio, he has to control everything and that's cool. But I mean, I know that he goes on tour with Michael McDonald and Boz Scaggs, and they call it like the Dukes of Stratosphere or something like that, which is like,
September, Dukes of September. Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
yeah. Why did I think? Yeah, that's his band, the Dukes of September, right? And it's like, probably every time they're booking this tour, like the promoters are like, "Can we call it Yacht Rock?" Or something like that, and he's
Like
just
there
got
will
his
be
thing.
measurably more tickets sold if we
Yeah,
can
right.
just put
Yeah,
that
I
word in it.
So many T-shirts.
Yeah, years ago, and I know this. JD told me this of the Yacht Rock
Yeah.
comedy series. JD and the guys that created the series were invited to a Steely Dan concert through them here in LA, and it was with Walter Becker was still alive, and Donald and Walter and Mike McDonald walked out in captain's hats. They have a sense of humor.
Okay, all right,
I think
yeah.
he has a sense. I think he has a sense of humor with this. I think he plays this.
He
Does
has an
his
image
thing.
to preserve, which I love. We love the guy.
It's so funny. Like my wife was here when that happened. She heard the whole conversation in the next room, and she walked up. She goes, "Did that guy just tell you to fuck yourself? Are you okay?" And I'm like, "This is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I had a phone call. He told me to go fuck. This was like amazing.
Yeah.
I have peaked. Yeah,
I got to say also, I think like Steely Dan just sort of like hovering above the picture works really well in the movie
yeah,
as well.
Mhm.
yeah.
I-
It's like
They're
it's
slightly too
phenomenal.
cool for the rest of the.
Yeah.
yeah. Were you aware at the onset that JD and Steve Huey were like genuine scholars and had like truly done the work to put the entire scene together? I mean, at the beginning, I'm like, oh, it's interesting that they, sort of read liner notes and figured out that this was a scene. But then over the course of the movie, you're like, oh no, they know everything about all of these records. They know it backwards and forwards in a way that even though it does like those those skits do come through as loving and knowledgeable. I don't know that I necessarily understood that they were being made by archivists,
Right.
And still had it to mind in 20 years later.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think they've kind of been forced to become like the ultimate scholars on this because of this monster they created. They had no. It's so funny talking to them. It's like yeah. I mean, Steve Huey, he's a music critic. He's got kind of he had a career of that before he came out here. So he knew music, and they're all just massive fans. But like, I think the response of that series, even back then, was so big that they kind of got forced, and they had a whole web podcast called Yacht or Yacht that they did for years. So they kind of became, whether voluntarily or not, the experts in this space. And I dug into a lot of that when I was doing my research and making that, and I knew I needed, again, when you're talking about an arbitrary genre of music, like you need someone that knows what that is, and again, you need those guides to take you through it and kind of set up these rules, or this thing could turn into a 4-part series on soft rock, which
Yeah.
completely wrong with what yacht rock is. So I knew I needed to part down, have a road to go down. And those guys were the way to do it. And to his credit, Questlove too. Like those 3 guys are kind of my kind of leaders that takes us through this world.
And Papademos too. Yeah.
Alex,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
he's incredible. And I mean,
Another former Rock Docs guest.
oh, was he
Yeah.
amazing? Yeah, and
Just
also,
lining them up.
Yeah.
when I had to tell a Steely Dan story, so I had to get people that know Steely Dan. So him, and then having Gary Katz, their producer, who's just so infectious and great,
Mhm.
to kind of help bring in like that person inside the room during this time is
Well,
always
he's
helpful
also
too.
a very funny character.
He's great.
He reminds me of like he could be like one of the neighbors in Beavis and Butthead or something.
It's so good. And that guy, it's so legendary. It's unbelievable. I mean, he ran A&R also for years at Warner Brothers. I mean, that guy it's again, man. Just the access to these people in this film and having this group of artists together that have never really been together to tell a
Mhm.
story and feed off each other. It's just like, and like again, them all being friends and be able to use that to move the narrative is just, I mean, as a storyteller, it's like winning the lottery.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, the best reveal in the movie is, we have interviews with Michael McDonald, we have interviews with Christopher Cross, and then effectively you pull the camera back and you see they're sitting next to each other.
Yeah.
I know it's a little bit different, staged a little differently than that, but that's the effect that happens in the movie.
Yeah.
And it's this is the first time we see these two of the people, everybody else is interviewed by themselves, I think, that I can recall. But these two, all of a sudden you see these two guys are sitting next to each other in a studio. And it really is just such like a warm moment
Yeah.
because it really does, like you could just tell from the body language and everything, like the comfort these people have with each other, like
Yeah.
as genuine friends or colleagues or whatever it is. Um, I mean, that was again, that's the editor mind, I guess, working right there. The fact that you put that together.
It's also that and just like all these artists, they're so centered, right? Like you see a lot of artists in their 70s now, and you see the what the road has done to a lot of people. These guys, I went in asking all of my first question was always, all right, tell me right off the bat. Let's talk about making music in the 70s and now now touring in your 70s. I think
Yeah.
it's so they're all so like genuinely appreciative that they still have careers, which is really
Yeah.
interesting and endearing, that they're out on the road still and people are still coming to their shows and not just fans that are the same age as them now. It's like they're bringing their kids and they have younger fans. I think again, the word yacht rock has a lot to do with that. It's pretty remarkable, and I think they've come to terms with that, and they understand that. I had a pretty special screening a couple weeks ago at the Grammy Museum here in LA, where
Mm.
we premiered the film for the artist. They had never seen it, and this was a week before it came out. So I had Michael McDonald, Christopher Cross, David Page, and Steve Picard from Toto, and David Pack from Ambrosia there. I also had all the web series guys there,
Mhm.
all of them, and none of them I've ever met before, which is pretty remarkable how much they've all changed each other's lives, yet they've never been in the same room together.
Wow.
And the film played, and we had a reception afterwards, and there were hugs and high fives and emails exchanged. It's pretty special. I think they've all, I think the artists see the reverence that the creators of the word really had for their music. And I think, the creators of the word yacht rock aren't scared of the artists anymore. I think they were always nervous that they offended them when it really came out of love and fun. And I think, I tore down the wall. I brought countries together.
Well, we're,
That's
we're
just,
also we're also, and this is surreal, and I apologize because I do some version of this insight basically every episode, but the Yacht Rock web series at this point is just about as old as Yacht Rock was
it's
when the web series came out.
pretty wild, right?
Yeah,
It's like
like it's not a new, like the newfound appreciation is not newfound any longer.
20 years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's 20 years old,
yeah,
and so if it was i- if it was insincere, it would have burned out by now.
absolutely. Yeah.
y- You know,
I love that. I mean, and again, and I think it's like, I think this music's here to stay now. Honestly, I think
yeah.
it's had its rise, it's had its fall. I think that people appreciate, its warmth and its nostalgia and its high production value. These are records you can put on and just keep on, you
Well, and
know?
now, and like, there was probably never a time that you could listen to some version of what was coming out in alternative music that you could compare certain bands to Yacht Rock, but it's really common now. I mean, there are a lot of bands that are wearing the influences of these bands on their sleeve these days. Um,
Absolutely.
and they come from all kinds of different areas of the musical world too. So yeah, I don't think it's going. I
Well,
certainly don't think it's going
it's
anywhere.
interesting talking to a lot of these musicians. I think they're also just jealous of that, like, lifestyle of studio musicians back then,
Yeah,
of, like,
yeah, yeah.
collaborating, being in these, recording studios, just figuring stuff
Getting
out
paid.
together, getting get
Getting
getting
paid.
paid, people spending money on albums. I think
Yeah,
music's become
super
so
analog, like really expensive albums. Yeah,
yeah, but, like
exactly.
and also I think that the idea, like, music's become so disposable now. We live in a world of singles now versus, like,
Mhm.
telling a story through an album and kinda showing, a piece of art, through song 1 through the last track. So I think, there's this jealousy of that time period, I think, for a lot of modern musicians.
Yeah. Well, so here, this is a half-formed thought. I'm not totally convinced I believe this, but I was thinking about it during the section about the sort of technological shift in the 80s, sort of hastening the demise of this
Yeah.
music. And I, I'm sort of, and I had this realization seeing how many different shots in your movie have images of Spotify playlists,
Yeah.
Mm.
that there's a technological role in the rebirth as well, that playing the game of what is yacht rock and what isn't yacht rock, and unearthing songs to put on a yacht rock playlist that you played at a party or that you shared with a friend, um it became part of what this was, just like debating what yacht rock was.
But
The sort of ease, the frictionless ability to create playlists, share them, to continue that debate, I think really was a boon to this whole thing.
I absolutely agree. And that's what makes this like this word so fun
Yeah.
is those debates. You can have water cooler
Mhm.
discussions still about
Yeah.
what is or is. I mean, God, again, the the I would my the DMs I'm getting, the tweets I'm getting, the emails I'm getting, the Facebook message like, about why didn't you use this? This is yacht rock. This
Yeah.
isn't against everything. The guys that created it, I'm just like it's. But like I welcome all of it because I think I would much rather make something that people are, like, arguing and talking about than like, "Oh, that was okay," and move on in life.
Mhm.
Like, at least, like,
Yeah.
people are like, I'm affecting people somehow in some way, and I think it's good, and, like, I think we need stories like this right now, especially, It's there's this it's harmless. It's just fun.
Yeah. I kind of had a similar thought, Andy. But my was that like, we grew up in the like CD age.
Yes. Yes.
And this music was not considered cool. And so if were like, hey, I really like Toto, and I'm gonna buy that CD and it's gonna be in my car when I like go to pick up a girl or something, whatever. You know what I mean? Like that was a high risk move in, 1994 or whatever. But in the streaming era, you know, like how many people really know what you're listening to on Spotify? I mean, right now, there's
Until
Spotify
the rap
Wrapped. Other than
until
that,
the rap comes out, yeah, at the end of the year.
no, but if you're sneaking in a Christopher Cross song after
Yeah.
you're listening to the Kendrick Lamar album or whatever, it's nobody's gonna know. You know what I mean? So it is a little bit of like, of the kind of music that maybe you wouldn't a certain people of a certain age or generation or era or whatever might not have seen themselves buying or trumpeting their fandom, but they would allow it to slip in, and then over time, everybody is, a lot of people are like that, and it becomes sort of accepted. Um, but kind of a similar, it's a little bit similar to like what we're doing here in a way with, which is like that a lot of people in that are interested in music love music documentaries,
Yeah.
but sometimes don't talk about it, or it's just like whatever, a little bit in the background. I think this music is a little bit similar in a way, where it's not that it's a guilty pleasure, but it's just again, it's not always top of mind to everybody. Like if somebody says like, who are your favorite artists, you might not think of these people, but then you might listen to them and really be into it. So I felt a kind of a weird kinship in a way with the genre, based on our whole little tiny project over here.
I love that. I told all my kind of collaborators, like my filmmaking team, I was like, I just want this movie to feel like a warm hug in the end,
Yeah.
right? Like I just want you to feel welcomed in. You can sit back. It was so perfect that we premiered like the day after Thanksgiving. I was like, look, no matter how contentious this year your Thanksgiving is, you can all just get together and agree upon one thing is this movie. You can just
Yeah.
chill
Michael
out.
McDonald.
Michael McDonald has an amazing voice, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but,
Right.
like, again, like, it kinda just, like, there's this, like, kind of innocence to it in a weird way, and there's an emotion to it too, like, we talk about it, this is, like, the OG emo music, these guys
Mhm.
were putting their emotions and feelings on their sleeve and singing about it, to the extreme, and it was okay, it was accepted, and people liked it, people bought these records and were listening to it, so, you know
They sure did. Yeah, I mean, and the like the role that hip hop plays bringing these songs together. Um, for my generation, I'm a little bit younger than David, and like I think for a lot of people my age, when the web series came about, you knew all these songs through hip hop.
Yeah.
Like hip the hip hop era who made that music was familiar with them because it was in their parents' record collection.
Right.
But then they made it available to another generation who was primed to like it because it already was so familiar in there. Oh, I know that song. That's from, that's from this. And it's like, I mean, it's like wheels within wheels or something. It's like
Right.
it's
It's a
like,
circle of life, right? Like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's kind of amazing, right? Yeah, but it makes sense because it was so ripe to be
yeah.
sampled because of the elements that make this music.
Yeah. I mean, and even like, I have always been a big jam band fan. And
Oh,
even
really?
even prior to, well, I'm telling Garrett, David, telling
Oh,
our
I
guest,
hadn't noticed.
the guest on the show, the like those bands, they cover those bands cover a lot of people. And even, before the web series came out, you would routinely interact with this music through covers that they wanted to play. And it was same thing. It was like, it's kind of a joke, but you like it, and so it's sincere and it's playful. And so, yeah.
Well, it's interesting you brought that up because I went and spent some time with these tribute bands like Yacht
Yeah, yeah.
Crew and
Yeah,
Yacht
yeah.
Rock Review, and there's another one, Yachty by Nature, which all have incredible names, right? But like again, I was amazed. I mean, thousands of people come to these shows. Thousands of people. It's and in their cosplay, wearing their captain's
Yeah.
hats. But the musicians themselves, like these aren't easy songs to play. A lot of these
Right.
are complex arrangements. That we talk about, and they're also like making original music now, also based upon these elements that make
Oh,
up
that's
yacht
interesting.
rock and the Fender Rhodes piano being like the backbone of it all and stuff. So it's like yes, there's this cottage industry now based off this word, but again, I think it's kind of beautiful in the end, So you have this side of it, you have the actual artists still touring in their 70s, and you have like kids making yacht rock music in garages now. Honestly, I talked to some. It's pretty
Yeah.
remarkable. Like you talked
Yeah.
about, these elements are in pop music now, and I think they're here to stay.
Yeah. Have you encountered by any chance Steely Dead?
No, I need to check them out. Is that a cover, a tribute band?
A tribute band that plays in and out of Steely Dan and Dead, Grateful Dead
Grateful Dead?
songs.
Where are they
Yeah,
out
so
of? Are they
I think they must be out of Southern California because they come
okay,
through San Diego twice a year or so.
okay,
So
I'll
I,
have
I
to check
bet
it out.
they're an LA band.
I mean, those are 2 great worlds to kinda merge together, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
It sounds like an LA Studio Cat type of band.
It's
You know what
Yeah,
I
very
mean?
right,
much.
Kind of
Yeah.
like Grateful Shred, where like they're it's like they can play this kind of stuff, so they'll do it
right.
on the.
And even Grateful Shred sounds like Grateful Dead music played by the world's biggest Steely Dan fans.
Okay,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
right, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, look, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if years from now, some musician, some musicians are inspired by this music because they discovered it from the film. I mean, that's kind of how these things happen. So I think you're playing a part, you guys. Not just you. Obviously, there's a bunch of people involved, but that this stuff does have an impact in the culture, and it's kind of cool to see that cycle back. And we'll see years from now. But I that's kind of my hope, because it's another opportunity for some really great music to live on, and just for these people to have their moment to tell their stories when maybe the like you said, the critical establishment wasn't so always so pleasant to them. And even now people are, there's probably a lot of people who think this music sucks, but that's true of everything, right? I mean, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It was a complete honor to, like, have the trust of these guys to tell their story, in this day of making music documentaries, it's harder and harder to be, to have the way you want to tell a story without artist interference, so to speak. So these guys really were hands off, sat with me, and kind of gave me the keys to the kingdom to tell the story. And it's one of the greatest honors of my life as a storyteller and a filmmaker to do it in a way that they're excited about, and hopefully audiences are too. So thanks, guys, again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, you've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate it. Do you want to tell us if you have another music doc in you, or you don't
Oh
have to tell
man,
us.
listen, I love music docs. I mean, they're catnip, right? Like, I mean, to me, to
You don't have to
people,
tell us.
yeah, but like, it has to be the right thing. I do. It has to be the right story. Um, you know, I, 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 I'm less. interested in like cradle to grave biodocs, and I kind of like finding these moments in music that you can really kind of lean into. Obviously through like Woodstock '99 and this one too. And so if the right story comes along, no matter how big or no matter how small, I'm there to hear it. And if it's the right thing that connects with me, I'm there to tell it.
Awesome. Well, whatever you do, we'll definitely be, keeping up. We're deep into the Garret Price cinematic universe. And either way, I hope we get a chance to talk to you again. But thanks again for doing this once again. And yeah, man, it was a lot of fun. Good doc. Congratulations. Well done.
Thanks guys for having me on again. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, man. And thanks for listening to Rock Docs.
LA in the 1970s.
It was an amazing time. There's these really talented session guys who can play anything.
Steely Dan.
The Doobie Brothers, Toto,
Kenny Loggins.
Christopher Cross, Michael fucking McDonald.
You have these sensational white musicians who had been acculturated on black music styles.
You write what you hear, what you feel.
A lot of the black stations picked up my first album. They made it a hit. It caused a buzz that we weren't used to getting.
Just seemed to really connect with the audience.
These artists provided the soundtrack of our lives, and then suddenly all that changed.
The video killed the radio star thing. It was just absolutely true in my case.
Top 40 careers have a natural end. They always do and always will.
I expected to be totally forgotten by the end of the 80s.
That's what a fool believes, Kenny. That's what a fool believes.
The term yacht rock emerged from a comedy show.
All of a sudden, this new genre we made up started to get embraced by the world.
Yacht Rock. Okay, where's my fucking yacht? I played on all those records.
I always thought it was kind of flattering to be made fun of.
I began to see that it was a kind of ass-backwards way to honor us.
Obviously, it made an impression on somebody.